News. We rely on it. We argue about it. Sometimes we even switch it off when it gets too much. But one thing's for certain, the way we watch the news has shaped the way we see the world. In Britain, for decades, two giants have battled for our attention. The BBC and ITN. One, the voice of the establishment, the other, the upstart, born in 1955 to serve a brand new television experiment called ITV. This is Independent Minds, the story of ITN, a story of visionaries and anchors, of innovation and failure, of politics, war, and those unforgettable bongs that told us it was 10 o'clock. I'm Rob Francis, and we're going to dive deep into the history of independent television news. Not just the bullet points, but the personalities, the battles, and the sheer audacity it took to reinvent television news. Let's set the scene. 1955. Britain is still a country in recovery. The Second World War ended just 10 years earlier. Churchill's out, Eden's in. The Festival of Britain has come and gone. Rationing has only just ended. Families are buying their first televisions. Wooden boxes, black and white, one channel. The BBC. The BBC was, frankly, untouchable. Its news bulletins were authoritative, sometimes too authoritative. Announcers wore dinner jackets, sat stiff as boards, and read copy like they were dictating royal decrees.
Here is an illustrated summary of the news. It'll be followed by the latest film of events and happenings at home and abroad.
And then came ITV. Commercial, cheeky, funded by advertising. To some in Westminster, it was a cultural apocalypse. To the public, it was a thrill. But ITV needed a news service. And fast. So in January 1955, 4 regional companies pooled resources and created ITN, Independent Television News. The name itself was almost a manifesto. Independent from government, independent from the BBC, independent in tone. On September the 22nd, 1955, ITV went on air. That very night, ITN made its debut at 10 p.m. It was shorter, snappier, friendly. And while the BBC had announcers, ITN had reporters, people who would go out into the world, get stories, and bring them back to the viewer.
Good evening. Here is the news from ITN. From Cape Canaveral, it's just been reported that following Colonel Glenn's success yesterday, another American spaceflight is to be made in the spring.
Now, this is one of the reasons why I love ITN's early years. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't trying to outgun the BBC with resources, because it couldn't. What it did do was change the relationship with the audience. It felt conversational, human, and honestly, that's the DNA that still runs through ITV News today. In 1959, ITN got its first big challenge, covering a general election. The BBC had the resources, the gravitas, the tradition. ITN, well, they had a few cameras, a handful of reporters, and a determination to show they could do it. On the 8th of October, viewers saw ITN's first election results programme. It wasn't perfect. There were technical hiccups, but it proved something vital. ITV could cover the nation's big moments. The early 1960s were quiet for ITN. Bulletins went out, the work was steady, but nothing revolutionary. The BBC was still dominant, ITN was still the other lot. But then in July 1967 came a decision that would change everything. News at 10. At first, just a 13-week experiment. 30 minutes of news in prime time. ITV bosses weren't sure it would work. The audience loved it. Suddenly, news wasn't something you caught in a 5-minute slot before the weather. It was an event. And let's not underplay those bongs. Genius branding. ITN had created instant authority. They said, pay attention. This matters. One of the key figures of News at 10 was Alistair Burnett. Calm, intelligent, and reassuring. He had the knack of making complex stories feel clear without dumbing them down. He embodied ITN's ethos, accessible but serious. It's easy to forget now, but News at 10 genuinely rattled the BBC. For the first time, RT had a rival who could do heavyweight news and pull in big ratings. From this moment on, ITN wasn't just ITV's in-house newsroom. It was a brand in its own right. In August 1969, ITN moved into ITN House at Wells Street. Now the geography here matters. This wasn't just new office, new postcode. They were moving in practically next door to the BBC's broadcasting house. And for me, that says everything about ITN's state of mind. They were still the young upstart, but there's a certain cockiness in setting up camp right under the nose of your bigger, older rival. It's like opening a burger van opposite Gordon Ramsay's restaurant. You're making a point. We're here, and we're not afraid of you. The early 1970s were a little barren. There were no real milestones until 1972. But what a change that year brought. Restrictions on broadcasting hours were finally lifted. Before then, ITV couldn't just broadcast whenever it wanted. Daytime television was heavily rationed, like post-war butter. Once the law was relaxed, ITV wasted no time. They launched an afternoon service, and with it came First Report, the very first lunchtime news.
The Lunchtime News from ITN with Robert Key.
Now, I think that this was one of the quietly revolutionary moves in British broadcasting. Before this, news was very much a bookend experience. You caught it in the morning, you caught it again in the evening. The middle of the day was, well, for working. But here came ITN saying, why shouldn't we update you at 1 o'clock? Maybe you want the news with your cheese and pickle sandwich. For me, this was ITV playing to its strengths, being just that little bit more populist, a little bit less stiff than the BBC. By 1976, First Report became News at 1. The branding shift may sound small, but I think it shows ITN starting to find its rhythm. It wasn't just putting programmes on because it could, it was building recognisable brands that viewers trusted. Same with the news at 5:45, a slightly extended tea time bulletin. These weren't massive flashy changes, but they built routine into people's lives, and television news was all about routine. The launch of Oracle in 1978 is another turning point that I found fascinating. Teletext feels like a relic now, but imagine being able to press a button on your remote control and choose when you wanted the headlines. That was radical. For me, that was the moment the seed of on-demand news was planted. It was clunky, sure, you had to wait for the page numbers to roll around, but in its way, it was decades ahead of what we'd later take for granted online. Now, if there's one date in this history that really stands out, it's the 2nd of November, 1982, the launch of Channel 4. Alongside Brookside and Countdown came Channel 4 News, which was produced by ITN. And this was different. A full hour of news every weeknight. When I watch those early programmes back on YouTube, I can see ITN almost relishing the freedom. No need to cram everything into 20 minutes. They could breathe, they could analyse, they could cover international stories properly. Honestly, I think Channel 4 News was the moment ITN proved it could do serious heavyweight journalism just as well as the BBC. Maybe even better. The mid-80s are where things start to get really interesting. ITN launched World News in 1987, appearing on the Super Channel across Europe. Suddenly, they're not just competing with the BBC at home, they're exporting British journalism abroad. And on the domestic front, ITV starts running proper morning schedules with short news bulletins. For someone who grew up watching television in that era, those snappy little updates were reassuring. They were like signposts in your day, tiny reminders that the world was turning, even if you were still in your dressing gown. But 1988 is where you can feel the drumbeat of 24-hour news starting. The ITN Early Morning News launched. It was a full 60-minute programme back then, but only if your region had 24-hour broadcasting. So depending on where you lived, you either got ahead of the curve, or you were still looking at a blank screen. Personally, I love the idea of bleary-eyed viewers in some parts of Britain already getting their fix of international news at 5 a.m, while others were stuck with snow on the screen. It shows how patchwork the television landscape was back then. And then there was 1989 and the Channel 4 Daily. I'll be honest, this one divides opinion. It was an odd hybrid of magazine segments, news from ITN, and Countdown. Was it slick? Not really. Was it necessary? Well, I'd argue yes. Because without experiments like that, ITV and ITN wouldn't have been ready for the rolling news revolution that was just around the corner. For me, even its failures were instructive. Looking back, the 70s were ITN learning how to occupy new slots. The 80s were ITN stretching itself, testing new formats, and edging closer to the 24-hour cycle we take for granted today. And personally, I think this era is what made ITN. The scrappy underdog that moved in next door to the BBC in 1969 had by the late 1980s become a confident multi-platform news organisation that was shaping habits, not just responding to them. 1991 was best remembered, of course, for the Gulf War. From the 16th of January through to early March, ITN was on air almost constantly. Extended news bulletins, rolling coverage, all-night reporting. This was a watershed moment for television journalism. Suddenly, news wasn't about waiting for fixed points in the day. It was live, urgent and relentless. The Gulf War made clear that the world had changed, and ITN rose to the occasion. I still remember the sheer weight of those broadcasts. Anchors calmly talking us through missile strikes, correspondents in flak jackets reporting live from the desert, the feeling that history was unfolding right there in your living room. It wasn't just coverage, it was theatre, but it was theatre of the most serious kind. And just as the Gulf War was ending, ITN was preparing for another major shift, a physical one. In 1991, ITN left behind Wells Street and moved into its gleaming new headquarters at 200 Gray's Inn Road in London, a building previously owned by the Sunday Times. And let me tell you, if Wells Street had been the scrappy student flat of ITN's youth, Gray's Inn Road was the modernist penthouse apartment. The centrepiece of the new building was its soaring atrium, a cavernous space with open lines of sight into the buzzing newsroom. ITN executives were very aware of what they had had, and they weren't going to hide it. From this point on, ITN bulletins were reimagined to showcase that atrium backdrop. Viewers at home didn't just see the presenter, they saw the entire engine of newsmaking humming away behind them. It gave the bulletins a sense of energy and transparency. You weren't being talked at from a sealed studio, you were being welcomed into the newsroom itself. There were exceptions though. The Lunchtime Bulletin, for example, continued from its own dedicated studio, and even kept its own theme music for a while. But even there, elements of the new look crept in. The serif fonts, the cleaner graphics. This was ITN's way of saying we're fresh, we're modern, we're open for business. In 1992, the news at 12:30 was renamed the Lunchtime News. The lineup of presenters made the programme feel warm yet authoritative. Nicholas Owen and Carol Barnes fronted most days, with Dermot Murnaghan, Sonia Rusula and Julia Somerville stepping in. Between 1992 and 1995, Owen and Barnes were the mainstays, and for me their pairing struck the perfect lunchtime balance. They had the gravitas you would expect from ITN, but also the kind of approachability that made you feel you could trust them with the midday headlines. Meanwhile, on the 2nd of March 1992, the news at 5:40 became the early evening news. John Suchet, with his trademark composure, became the lead presenter. The programme was presented from the ITV newsroom, adjacent to the atrium. Once again, ITN was showcasing not just the news, but the process of making it, and for viewers, that mattered. But it was News at 10 that went through the most dramatic change. In 1991, ITN had lost Sir Alistair Burnett, a stalwart of the bulletin since the 1960s. Early the next year, Sandy Gall also stepped back, though he continued to file special reports. The departures of those titans could have left the programme adrift. Instead, ITN doubled down. On the 9th of November 1992, News at 10 unveiled a brand new look. Out went the old set. In came sleek monitors, a large video wall, and a curved desk with News at 10 inscribed across it. And at the centre of it all, Trevor McDonald. Trevor wasn't new to viewers, of course, but making him the sole anchor of News at 10 was a masterstroke. He brought not only authority, but warmth, charisma, and an ease that made you lean in. For many of us, Trevor was ITN in the 1990s. Relief presenters included John Suchet, Dermot Murnaghan and Julia Somerville, but Trevor McDonald was the face viewers came to trust. Initially, the revamped News at 10 was even presented from the same studio as the early evening news, again right next to that bustling atrium. The symbolism was clear. ITN was serious news, but it was also fast, busy and modern. By 1995, ITN decided it was time for a complete visual overhaul. This wasn't just a refresh, it was a relaunch across all bulletins. Out went the mismatched looks. In came a unified visual identity built around ITN's corporate blue. Sets were rebuilt, this time with semi-transparent blue perspex walls that allowed glimpses into both the newsroom and the lobby. The effect was striking, a mixture of transparency and theatre. You saw the people, the computers, the buzz of activity, but all framed within ITN's own brand identity. And the music? Well, the famous News at 10 theme was reinterpreted by Dave Hewson, with variations crafted for each bulletin. It was cohesive but distinct. You always knew you were watching ITN, but the tone shifted appropriately for lunchtime, early evening or late night. The relaunch was designed by Lambie Nairn, one of the great names in British television broadcasting. And honestly, they nailed it. For me, this was ITN at its most confident, proudly displaying itself as a 24/7 news hub while keeping the bulletins distinct and authoritative. For 3 decades, News at 10 was ITV's crown jewel. It was iconic, the big bang bongs, the gravitas of Alistair Burnett and later Trevor McDonald, and the sense that if you wanted to understand what had happened in Britain that day, you tuned in at 10. It wasn't just a news bulletin, it was an institution. And yet, in the early 90s, ITV began eyeing it with suspicion. Despite News at 10's continued stature and popularity, in 1993, ITV stunned the industry by announcing plans to scrap it. The idea was to replace it with 2 peak time bulletins, one at 6:30 and another at 11. Their justification? Well, ITV argued that viewing audiences were in decline, that the rigid placement of a half-hour news programme at 10 o'clock was choking their ability to run movies, dramas and big entertainment shows without interruption. But this wasn't just a scheduling tweak. It was sacrilege. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Viewers protested, members of Parliament weighed in, even Prime Minister John Major criticised the plans, warning ITV not to meddle with a national ritual. The National Heritage Committee also raised its voice, effectively saying ITV was treating public service obligations as an inconvenience rather than a duty. The Independent Television Commission stepped in like an annoyed headmaster. Their ruling was scathing. ITV hadn't built a strong enough case. If audiences were down, the ITC pointed out, they were down even more at the BBC. And what was the BBC doing in response? Well, it wasn't axing its flagship bulletin, but it was reshaping the format to keep it fresh. ITV, by contrast, looked like it was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Under threat of legal action, the proposals were shelved. For a while. Because of course ITV didn't give up. The commercial imperative was too tempting. By the late 90s, ITV was lobbying hard again, this time with renewed energy. In September 1998, the ITC finally caved. Sort of. After extensive research which found that the public still wanted News at 10 to stay by a margin of 5-3, the regulator agreed to a compromise. ITV could axe News at 10, but only for a 1-year trial period. So in March 1999, Britain lost its nightly ritual. The final News at 10 aired, and in its place came a brand new primetime schedule. News bulletins would now air at 12:30, 6:30 and 11 p.m. ITN, still the producer, rebranded everything under the single banner of ITV News. Trevor McDonald fronted the new flagship evening news at 6:30, while a token 1-minute news summary at 10 o'clock was followed later by a late bulletin at 11. How did it go? Well, not too good. ITV argued it would boost overall ratings, freeing up uninterrupted drama slots, but in reality, audiences were unimpressed. Within a year, ITV News was down almost 14% in viewing figures. The 1-minute summary at 10 o'clock felt perfunctory, even insulting. Viewers hadn't wanted to lose their nightly ritual. And when they did, many simply switched to the BBC. In 2000, the ITC finally forced ITV's hand, ordering the return of News at 10 to stop the rot. But by this point, the damage had been done. The BBC had seized the opportunity, moving its long-running 9 o'clock news to 10 o'clock. Suddenly, ITV's prestige slot wasn't just back, it was under direct competition. For years, it had owned the hour. Now, it had to fight for it. And even when News at 10 returned, it was never the same. Scheduling became a mess. ITV didn't commit to airing it every night. Instead, it was broadcast only 3 nights a week, with entertainment shows overrunning on the others. And when it did air, it was often delayed and shuffled out of its slot. That inconsistency gave birth to a cruel nickname, News at When, a jab that stuck and one that ITV couldn't shake. The BBC, meanwhile, held firm. The 10 o'clock news was fixed, 6 nights a week. Viewers knew exactly when to find it, and they did. By 2003, ITV admitted defeat. They received approval to kill off News at 10 once more and replace it with a fixed 10:30 p.m. bulletin. That stability, ITV argued, would at least restore some consistency. On the 2nd of February 2004, Trevor McDonald launched the new ITV News at 10:30. He presented it until his retirement in December 2005, passing the baton to Mark Austin in early 2006. In the late summer of 1999, ITN made a bold announcement. It would launch its very own dedicated news channel. The plan was to get it on air by the end of the year, directly challenging BBC News 24, Sky News, and even CNN International. On paper, it sounded ambitious, maybe even overdue. But there was a catch. The longer ITN took to get this channel live, the more it risked looking like a latecomer to a party it should have been hosting. And sure enough, delays chipped away at the momentum. When the channel finally launched on the 1st of August 2000, it arrived as the ITN News Channel, a joint venture between ITN and the cable giant NTL. It wasn't just marketed as another rolling news station. ITN pitched it as the world's first multimedia news channel. That meant you could access it not only on television, but also on digital radio and even mobile phones, years before most of us thought about streaming live news in our pockets. Ahead of its time? Absolutely, but sometimes being ahead of your time is a problem in itself. By June 2002, the balance of power shifted though. Carlton and Granada, the ITV companies that would soon merge into ITV plc, bought out ITN's majority stake. Within a few months, the channel was rebranded as the ITV News Channel. It was no longer a bold, standalone venture. It was now absorbed into ITV's wider strategy. In February 2004, the channel enjoyed something of a relaunch. This was the era of the so-called Theatre of News set, a huge virtual studio with sweeping backdrops, space for presenters to walk around, and a news wall for explainers and graphics. It looked slick, modern, and different from the old sit-behind-a-desk model. 2 presenters could now host together, which ITV management hailed as a big step forward. In truth, it felt like ITV was finally putting some real production weight behind the channel, trying to make it distinctive. Then in April 2004, ITV plc, by now a fully merged single company, bought out NTL's remaining 35% stake, taking complete control. For a moment, it looked as if ITV might fully commit to its rolling news channel, pushing harder against Sky and the BBC. But the reality was different. By the end of 2005, the writing was on the wall. On the 15th of December, ITV confirmed that the channel would be axed in 2006. Its Freeview bandwidth, already time-shared with ITV4, would be handed over to a brand new CITV channel. The money saved would, ITV insisted, be redirected into boosting news on its main terrestrial network. They even promised fresh bulletins on ITV2 and ITV3, but as often happens with ITV announcements, that bit never materialised. The actual closure came sooner than expected. On Friday, the 23rd of December 2005 at 6 p.m, the channel signed off for the last time. The reasoning was strangely humane. ITV said it wouldn't be fair to keep staff working through the Christmas period, knowing that the axe was about to fall. And just like that, the ITV News channel was gone. Consigned to history, after barely 5 years on air. Looking back, the ITV News channel felt like a missed opportunity. It was a good idea, and in some ways ahead of its time, but ITV never gave it the resources or the long-term commitment to truly challenge Sky or the BBC. I personally think if it had launched earlier, with ITN retaining full control, it might have carved out a stronger identity. Instead, it became the casualty of ITV's endless juggling act between cost-cutting and ambition. From the very beginning of Channel 5 in 1997, ITN was at the helm of its news output, producing the bulletins branded as 5 News. Now that partnership lasted until January 2005, when ITN unexpectedly lost the contract to Sky News. For ITN, it was a rare setback, a reminder that in the competitive world of commercial broadcasting, nothing was guaranteed. The pendulum swung back in 2011 when ITN regained the contract in a new 3-year deal to produce Channel 5's news from early 2012. However, this return came with strings attached. The budget was significantly smaller than before, a reflection of the channel's tighter resources under its then owner, Northern and Shell. In fact, Sky and Northern and Shell reached a separate agreement to end Sky's involvement early, clearing the way for ITN's return. For nearly a decade, ITN delivered 2 half-hour evening bulletins for Channel 5, supported by a series of shorter bulletins through the day. That format lasted until 2021, when Channel 5, now owned by Viacom CBS, sought a shake-up in its early evening schedule. The broadcaster applied to Ofcom for permission to drop its long-standing 6:30 news slot, making space for Neighbours and Eggheads. Ofcom approved the change, reasoning that public service broadcasting still offered 3 solid hours of early evening news across all major channels. And the relaunch came on the 8th of November 2021, with the debut of 5 News at 5, an extended hour-long programme airing at 5 p.m. Then in January of 2022, ITN's role at Channel 5 expanded further. The channel handed ITN an extra hour of live programming each weekday morning by extending Jeremy Vine's daily phone-in and discussion show. With that, ITN's partnership with Channel 5 moved firmly beyond traditional bulletins into broader current affairs and audience interaction. By the mid-2000s, ITV News was undergoing one of its periodic identity crises. On January 16, 2006, the network unveiled a full visual overhaul to coincide with the launch of the new ITV corporate logo. Out went the familiar blues and yellows of the past few years, and in came a bold teal colour scheme. The graphics were sharp, modern, and very much of their time. Even the famous News at 10 clock face was reworked into the opening titles, while the studio itself now leaned heavily on virtual reality backdrops. The centrepiece was a digital atrium, what ITN proudly called its theatre of news. Personally, I always thought that it felt slightly more like a glossy showroom than a newsroom, but it was undeniably a statement. ITV was trying to look modern, sleek and competitive in an era when BBC News 24 and Sky News were raising the stakes. Later that same year, the teal experiment began to soften. The on-screen graphics shifted back to more traditional blues, although the teal clock face opening remained. Looking back, it feels like ITV realised it had perhaps gone a bit too bold with the rebrand and was trying to pull things closer to the network's established identity. Meanwhile, in the boardrooms, ITV's new chairman, Michael Grade, was making waves. In 2007, he declared that axing the original News at 10 back in 1999 had been the worst mistake ITV ever made. And he wasn't wrong. Viewers had never really forgiven ITV for moving its most iconic bulletin. It was more than just a time slot. It was a national ritual. So in January 2008, News at 10 returned. The theme tune was reworked but still familiar. And Trevor McDonald came back, joined by Julie Etchingham, poached from Sky. The studio had a new look, a virtual nighttime view of London, Big Ben still looming large, and a moody palette of dark blues and blacks. For me, this relaunch was like ITV News rediscovering its backbone. It was saying, yes, we tried to reinvent the wheel, and now we're admitting that the wheel worked perfectly well. By 2009, ITV was once again tinkering with presentation. The earlier experiment of having newscasters stand up in front of giant virtual reality backdrops was quietly dropped. From the 9th of February, bulletins returned to a more traditional behind-the-desk format. And personally, I think this was a good move. There's something reassuring about seeing a news anchor at a desk. It gives a sense of authority. The virtual reality elements didn't disappear completely though. London skylines glowed behind presenters, and virtual glass panels carried graphics and live links. But ITV was clearly paring things back, going back to basics, as Grade had promised. The familiar theatre of news set, which had framed ITV news bulletins for 5 years, made its final appearance on Sunday the 1st of November 2009. The following day, viewers were greeted with a very different look. The centrepiece of this revamp was a break with one of the network's most recognisable traditions, the removal of the Big Ben clock tower from programme openings, including News at 10. After what ITV executives described as months of deliberation, the conclusion was that leaning so heavily on a London landmark risked alienating viewers across the rest of the UK. The solution was more subtle. A clock face was retained as part of the new studio backdrop and title sequence, and the more famous headline bongs remained in place. The studio itself was redesigned in a sleek rectangular style, with black and gold graphics to complement ITV1's branding at the time. Even the music got a refresh. Out went the long-established The Awakening theme, replaced by a new composition, News Centre. It wasn't a total break from the past, a few motifs from the old tune remained, but it was a clear attempt to modernise the sound and feel of ITV News. Across the regions, ITV's local news programmes continued to use their 2004 studio sets, but with an updated colour palette and title sequence to keep everything in line with the national look. On the 16th of November 2012, ITV confirmed that ITV News would relaunch again in January 2013. Just a few weeks later, it emerged that the long-running ITV Morning News would be axed, with resources diverted into digital journalism for ITV.com and a new foreign affairs unit. This rebrand brought back The Awakening, this time in a stripped-down, more direct arrangement. It also saw Big Ben return to the title sequence as a time-setting device for each bulletin. But there was one symbolic departure. The ITN name vanished from the on-screen branding. The production credit now simply read ITV News, with ITN demoted to a small line of text beneath. The next big shift came a decade later. In January 2022, ITV confirmed its evening news would be extended to a full hour at 6:30 p.m. from March, creating the most substantial early evening national news slot on British television. And in July that year, attention turned to the future of streaming. ITV announced that its new platform, ITVX, would host a 24-hour ITV News service. Not a conventional rolling news channel, but a constantly updated feed of on-demand journalism, combining live bulletins, special programmes, in-depth investigations, and explanatory reports. The service launched in December 2022, positioning ITV News not just as a broadcaster for set times of the day, but as a brand that could live permanently in the digital space. As we wrap up this journey through 70 years of ITN, I can't help but reflect on just how remarkable its story really is. From that scrappy start in the mid-1950s, through the bold innovations of the 70s, the war reporting of the 90s, and right up to the digital-first strategies of today, ITN has always had this ability to adapt. It's never been afraid to challenge the BBC, to reinvent the way news looks and sounds, and to put viewers at the centre of the story. What strikes me most is that ITN has always balanced two things that don't often go together in broadcasting: credibility and creativity. They've delivered some of the most trusted journalism in Britain, but they've also been willing to experiment, sometimes succeeding, sometimes stumbling, but always pushing forward. And in doing so, they've shaped the way all of us think about television news. For me, ITN's 70 years are more than a history of bulletins, studios and theme tunes. They're a story about trust, about the relationship between broadcaster and audience, about knowing that whether it's the assassination of President Kennedy, the Gulf War, the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, or the COVID-19 pandemic, ITN would be there to tell Britain what was happening and why it mattered. So thank you for tuning into this special podcast episode looking back at 70 years of ITN. I have loved taking this journey with you. Don't go anywhere, because in the second part of our look back at 70 years of ITV, we're going to be shifting gears and focusing on breakfast television. Now there's a subject full of lively stories, ambitious experiments and some truly unforgettable moments. Until then, you can explore even more about the history of television presentation at tvlive.site, a fantastic resource for anyone as nerdy about this stuff as I am. I'm Rob Francis, and this has been Independent Minds. Thank you for listening.